Welcome to our webinar on healthcare beyond carbon. Today we're going to be discussing the challenges of decarbonization in the healthcare space and healthcare infrastructure, looking at a white paper that we here at WSP produced towards the end of last year, looking at the decarbonization journey of several different healthcare systems that we happen to work in across the world. My name is Kevin Cassidy. I am the Canadian Health and Science Market Lead for WSP, as well as the Global Market Lead for Healthcare within our global healthcare network here at WSP. Healthcare is a very important sector for all of us, and one of the most important places where WSP's property and buildings business, as well as our other businesses, are able to really make a huge difference for people around the world in all the countries that we work in. Joining me today, we've got 4 panelists from different parts of the globe, all within WSP. And to introduce themselves, maybe I'll hand it over first to Vanessa.
Thanks, Kevin. My name is Vanessa Nevin. I'm an Associate Director in Strategic Advisory, and my main focus is on ESG and health. And I'm joining today from the beautiful New Zealand.
Great, thank you. Anthony?
Hi everyone, Anthony Palesci. I work in our climate change, resilience and sustainability team focused on decarbonization planning in Canada, actually, where Kevin also is. I'm super excited to talk to you about this today, so thanks so much.
All right. Zach.
Yeah, hi, Zach Stevens here. I'm a Vice President in the Built Ecology team, which is the sustainability practice within property and buildings in the United States. I'm a vertical lead for healthcare, specializing in decarbonization. And I'm calling in today from Seattle, Washington.
All right, thanks, Zach. And Alvaro.
Hi, Alvaro Rudia here. I am an architect and project coordinator, part of the property and building team located in Santiago, Chile.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, everybody. So for the first part of our webinar today, I wanted to just give the audience a high-level overview of the white paper and some of the things that we discovered. But before we jump into that, what we would like to do is actually just go through a little bit of a poll. Maybe speakers, I could ask you to turn your cameras off and just go on your cameras and microphones off for now so we can go through that. And you can see that we've polled or put up on the screen a poll. We'd like to ask the audience just to give us an understanding of where you might be within your decarbonization strategy, or perhaps your clients that you might be working with, trying to get an understanding of where we stand right now and what the importance is for you in decarbonization. You can see there's a few options up there. Not sure where to start. We've got a strategy, but not a roadmap. Our roadmap is in place, but implementation is a challenge. We're implementing our roadmap now, or we're actually starting to see results from implementation. Just curious to see where people are. We can see there's a few folks coming in with their responses. Very interesting. So we can see a few of them coming up. And definitely very few people. We do have a couple of votes there for starting to see results from implementation. I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes. We'll close the poll down. Interesting. So as you can see, and I don't think it's horribly surprising, a lot of people are still very early on in their strategy. 5% of the respondents said they're starting to see results. So that'd be very interesting to hear what those results look like. I think this is indicative of a lot of the market right now where people know that there's some issues, they know that there's things that they have to do, but they're not entirely sure where to begin, or if they have begun, how do they actually get through to that implementation phase. So it would be interesting to discuss from the few folks that are starting to see changes. So on that note, maybe what we can do is start to talk a bit about the actual white paper that we developed and what some of the potential solutions might be. So, why did we do this? We realized that there was a very clear need to kickstart a global conversation on decarbonizing healthcare facilities worldwide. That's why we went through and brought some of the experts from different parts of the country together to talk about what the challenges and potential solutions are for decarbonization of healthcare. We took a look at 9 different healthcare systems and where they were in their respective journeys to net zero. So keeping in mind, it's not just about a specific building, but about the systems themselves and what some of those challenges are. There's definitely, from a key motivation perspective, definitely a global mission. We have a single global mission to reach net zero by 2050. But then once we started talking to individual healthcare clients, we understood that there was a number of them that were really struggling to understand how the different policy, economic, industry and environmental different policies might be coming into place and actually influencing what that decision-making process and implementation was going to be like for them. And they were struggling to learn from each other, find good information on what's been working well and what hasn't. So as we go through this, we're going to go through some of the key takeaways that we came back with after developing the paper. And as we look at some of those key takeaways, hopefully that will spark some conversation with our panel towards the end of the webinar. So we realized as we started to go through it, first of all, we needed to take a look at the key metrics of a successful healthcare system. So what you can see up here on the screen are the 9 different countries or regions we looked at: United States, Canada, UK, Sweden, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Hong Kong, and South Africa. Some of these systems very well established and sophisticated, some privatized, some public systems, some a mixture of both. Some of them with varying degrees of resources available in order to invest. Typically, when we're looking at those healthcare systems, some of the metrics that are used quite often would include health expenditure as a percentage of that country's GDP, which you can see in the blue bubbles. The actual number of hospital beds per 1,000 population, which is up at the top. How easy is it for you to get healthcare and access to a bed within your respective country? And then health expenditure per capita, which you can see down on the bottom. So, not much of a surprise when you take a look at the United States as an example, that's spending a significant amount of its GDP on healthcare, that they're also spending a significant amount per capita. But there are, some surprises that are in there as well too, where you can see, as an example, some of the countries that have a similar spend. Sweden, as an example, has got over $5,000 per individual being spent on healthcare, but their bed count is lower than the UK or Canada, who are comparable as far as the spend is concerned. But what if we were able to also use carbon as a key metric for a successful healthcare system? So that doesn't come into the play when you're looking at the key metrics we're using right now. What is the societal impact and the cost of our healthcare system on the communities that they serve if we start to look at that environmental impact and their carbon output, and can we use that as a key metric to determine the success of a healthcare system? So of course, to start that off, we had to take a look at the actual carbon emissions and how much does healthcare actually contribute. Globally, healthcare accounts for about 5% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And what you can see here are a few different numbers that we started to use to take a look at what percentage on a country by country basis what the impact actually is of that healthcare space. Greenhouse gas emissions as a percentage of national emissions, you can see up at the top, ranging anywhere from 2.5% for South Africa up to 6.7% for the United States. And down on the bottom, the healthcare emissions per person measured in actual tons of carbon per year. Ranges again from South Africa at 0.29 up to 1.86 for the US. So what's interesting about that is, even though Canada, as an example, is under 5% of their total national emissions per capita, it's actually quite high compared to some of the other countries that we took a look at. Perhaps the biggest thing, when it all boils down to at the end of the day, is looking at what the actual greenhouse gas emissions are in a real number. And off to the right, you can see those bubbles represent the total number of megatons of CO2 that the healthcare system has emitted. All those bubbles ranging from New Zealand at 3.45 up to 43 megatons for Canada, but dwarfing everything is that large bubble for the US at 595 megatons, which is, you know, obviously absolutely massive. The paper then started to dive into where hospitals are actually getting their energy from. What are the energy sources that they use? For the healthcare practitioners or people on the line that operate these facilities, I don't think there's going to be a great surprise here. From a heating and hot water perspective, almost every system is deriving their heating and hot water energy sources from some type of fossil fuel, typically natural gas, and in some cases, diesel oil, and diesel oil also being used primarily as a backup for those heating sources. The one exception being Sweden, who has quite a bit of district energy available that they can tap into, decarbonized district energy for their heating supply. Electricity-wise, again, most hospitals are getting all of their power from the grid. A few in the UK, the United States, and Canada, there are hospitals that are using combined heating and power systems, which are able to they're able to derive both heat and some electricity from. And again, almost exclusively diesel generators being used for that backup power supply. So this starts to beg the question, if we are using electricity and we're going to start looking at electricity as a potential way to derive our heating and be able to decarbonize, where's the grid getting their renewable energy from? Are they renewable? How fast are they switching? Excuse me. So we thought it would be useful to look at the degree that all of these grids were becoming renewable across all 9 of the countries we were looking at. The clear front runner being New Zealand, where 80% of their energy is powered by renewables, primarily through a mix of hydro, marine, and geothermal energy. What's interesting about this too is Canada's not that far behind if you were actually going to be looking at nuclear as also potentially a clean power supply. So the paper did not take that into account. There's definitely some discussion around that, but if you're able to look at nuclear, another 15% would be added to Canada's number of 67. New Zealand doesn't currently have nuclear generation as part of their energy mix. There are definitely some challenges you can see in the United States and Australia as an example, definitely in South Africa and Hong Kong, where electrification might help with the source right at the hospital, but there's a much larger issue that needs to be dealt with. Now, the focus of the paper, you know, that could be a whole other discussion and deep dive into how we actually decarbonize hydro providers or electricity utility providers. So we really started to look at this from the point of view of what can you do on site to help make a change, and where healthcare as an industry can make the most effective change. So what did we start to look at in terms of potential solutions? So first of all, it's important that we start off not just looking at a facility by facility basis. We need to start at the portfolio and the system level. So where are we actually delivering care? Are you taking a portfolio approach to how you're building your infrastructure with the carbon impact of your decisions being right at the forefront of that decision-making process? Where are people receiving care? Do we need to have all of our services in an acute care mega hospital, which are notoriously high use, have notoriously high intensity energy usage? Can we start looking at diversifying a little bit more that healthcare, providing ambulatory care services in different types of buildings, making sure that we're able to distribute that care out? There's also challenges in a lot of our larger countries that have less population density, right? How far are people traveling to access care? How often do they need to travel for cancer treatment, and how are they getting there? If everybody is driving in their own car several hundred kilometers in order to get care for multiple weeks out of the year, there's obviously a very large carbon impact that the facility is influencing, even though it's not directly responsible for. So if we start to rethink on where we're actually building our healthcare infrastructure and the intensity of those facilities, we can have a tremendous impact on total systems carbon emissions throughout that entire portfolio of buildings that a healthcare system might have. As we start to dive down into the actual buildings, we started to take a look at campus scale opportunities. Where can we electrify and actually become good stewards of the grid to really influence change and start to eliminate some of those carbon emissions? Sweden's very much quite far ahead of the ball in terms of using district energy and using heat supply from resource or reject heat from their neighbors in order to help heat their hospitals. But there's a lot of work that hospitals could do when they start looking at the context of their communities. Are there opportunities for new developments and existing hospitals that are adjacent to other buildings to create central utility plants that can both power and heat the hospital, that can make connections into microgrids and provide opportunities to heat and power their neighbors, actually becoming self-sufficient and becoming net exporters of energy? We started to take a look at life cycle carbon thinking. The reality is the construction of buildings and the energy usage of our buildings are not the major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Over 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions are actually applicable to the scope 3 emissions of a hospital. The actual supply chain, where are you getting your materials from? How are you using those materials? Over 50% of the issue is coming from that piece. And so making smart decisions around how you're actually using your infrastructure to control that supply chain, utilizing some of your influence with your suppliers to make sure that they're being responsible stewards to the environment becomes very important. Then we also started to dive into funding routes. How are we actually building these hospitals? How are we procuring them? From a procurement perspective, there's clearly a lot of different ways that hospitals have been procured. In the UK and Canada, as an example, both countries have had widespread P3 healthcare programs. For new projects, and a P3 project in Canada, as an example, we need to make sure that decarbonization is getting embedded into the contract, that we're using life cycle cost drivers and taking into account the full cost of not acting too soon. Existing hospitals that have been procured this way, we're finding that there's some challenges now because we weren't having that flexibility built into some of the project agreements early on, and they're starting to come into this point where they're being handed back to owners. How do you now get decarbonization incentives and investment into those buildings when the contracts aren't necessarily set up to allow it to happen? So it's a major issue that needs to be dealt with, and something that we need to think of as we're developing new hospitals under some of these P3 or even collaborative models. When we start to take a look at funding of actual decarbonization strategies, we've actually taken a look at what's working in different countries. Is it better to have policy driving targets that you need to make and actually having punitive taxes and charges if you're not meeting those goals? Or is it better for it to be voluntary and you're incentivizing people with savings by actually meeting some of those targets? Very different approaches between countries that actually led to quite a bit of interesting discussion. So that whole carrot and stick mentality gets not a clear answer necessarily coming through, but it's been very interesting to look at the different aspects and what might work in some different countries. Of course, the most critical thing in any hospital is making sure that healthcare priorities come first. Infection control, as an example, and decarbonization, is it a symbiotic or a disharmonious relationship? Quite often we'll start discussions in infection control. People's opinion is that it's diametrically opposed to decarbonization. But if we were able to put a bit more investment into the early design process, started using tools like CFD modeling, started to take a look at how the air is actually moving, would we be able to minimize airflows and energy while keeping patients still safe? This is definitely something that we are able to do in certain countries, dramatically lowering fan energy, still making sure that patient outcomes and patient safety, as well as the safety of caregivers, is paramount. To do that in some other jurisdictions, it's going to require a challenge of codes and standards. And also we need to start talking to each other and sharing data and lessons learned so that we can see what the impact of actually making some of these changes actually would be. So, we start to, where are we going in 2050? Right, operational carbon, it's set to be the tip of the iceberg by 2050. And we need to start taking this long life, loose fit approach to the new infrastructure that we're building. I talked a little bit about it in the procurement model discussion, but if we invest a little bit more to achieve longevity while being zero carbon on day one, we're going to set ourselves up to have a robust portfolio of healthcare infrastructure that supports a robust healthcare system to address all the challenges that the future is going to bring. Existing hospitals and existing portfolios becomes a little bit challenging, right? In that new construction, you typically have a large injection of capital where you can start making some of these decisions. In your existing portfolio, you might have some challenges around, well, I'm just struggling to keep the lights on, or I'm struggling to get boilers replaced. How do I make sure that I'm doing the right thing with decarbonization and doing the right thing as a good steward of the environment? You need to take that portfolio-wide approach. You need to look at your plan investment and renewal and make sure that you're having a decarbonization action baked into your plan, that the decisions that you're making are all the small steps that are leading towards that ultimate goal of decarbonization. And it means taking a look at that entire portfolio and what the impacts of your decisions are going to be. So, where do we start? We need to be sharing our experiences. We found, as even just within our own firm, as we were talking this through, there were a lot of things that people were doing that we weren't talking about. Even in some instances, you'd have countries where the things that they were doing to them seemed to be status quo and very easy things to do. But other countries had no idea or had never even talked about it before. So just sharing some of that information, even if individuals think it's a minor point, is absolutely critical to beginning this journey as a whole healthcare system across the globe. We need to make sure that we're standardizing around a common language, frameworks and metrics. We need to make sure that we're standardizing data. If we're not standardizing data, it was even difficult for us to compare one hospital in one country to another because the way that they report their energy usage or their carbon was different. If we can't standardize that, we're going to have a difficult time learning from each other. So really, it is about communication, about taking action and making sure that we're getting access to data so we can drive decision making. And maybe on that note, I'll pause there and ask our panelists to turn their cameras back on and microphones, and we can have a little bit of a discussion. There we go, and now Vero is back. Great, so going through a little bit of a Q&A with the panel, I would ask and encourage the audience, please use the Q&A section of the webinar and the controls here in GoToMeeting to ask some questions. We can get through to some of those towards the end of the webinar. But maybe first off, I've got a couple of questions I wouldn't mind throwing out to the panel myself. Maybe the first one, which we'll send out to everybody, we'll start with the easy ones first. Why should healthcare systems invest in decarbonization when they're struggling to just fund their basic healthcare services? And I'm curious to see across the different regions what sort of challenges, unique or otherwise, there might be. And maybe Zach, I'll throw that over to you first in the US.
Sure. Yeah, I can start with that. That really is the kind of fundamental crux type question. So it's important when I think about this one, there's a few different levels in how you think about it. The most fundamental level of this is going back to the mission of the healthcare organizations that are our clients and that we're doing work with. And most of them, like top line item in their mission statement, has something to do with safeguarding or improving community health, whether it's a rural hospital or urban hospital or different healthcare providers. That is the core mission. And we know that there are these major health impacts hanging in the balance in how, as a globe and how, as an industry, we're able to decarbonize. And it's not just the big headline piece of, oh, there's going to be someday there'll be scarier, future climate events that will have downstream health impacts, whether it's heat strokes or emergencies from storms or things like that. But it's also like at home in our communities, directly related to point source emissions, where we're combusting fossil fuels. There's been a lot of recent studies around the impact on respiratory health, development of asthma in children, things like this. And all of these things together show up as future costs. A lot of it is to the healthcare system. You look at any calculation of the social cost of carbon, and a lot of that is healthcare costs that will materialize if we continue to emit carbon. But that kind of gets to the collective action problem of addressing climate change. So it's hard for an individual healthcare organization to say, well, I'm going to be the one to change that, even though I'm a drop in the bucket. So the other level to that is, and they're trying to figure out how to allocate their funding as a healthcare organization. So the second layer is more directly related to their budget. How can they deploy capital in a smart way so that they can continue to provide health services in the long term? And that's where we can really provide a ton of value, and showing them how life cycle cost thinking that layers in decarbonization, that's thinking about future regulations. What are the risks from new building energy performance standards that have some fees that we're seeing in the United States? Carbon taxes are showing up in a few states in the US. It's very decentralized. We can get into that. Codes are getting stricter. Am I going to end up with stranded assets if I stick with what I've always traditionally done for fossil fuels? What incentives are out there that I could take advantage of? And we put all those together, and you can really have a strong life cycle cost case to make for decarbonization. But you've got to connect those dots for them, because those pools of money, the operating costs, the capital costs, are not always in the same place for these healthcare organizations. So we have to be really clear in our consulting, analysis, storytelling to help kind of bring that together for our clients.
Thanks. And Anthony, if we jump up just north of the border from Zach, there, is it similar challenges in Canada, or what are you seeing with the system there?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Zach said at the end is a little, it's a little easier to do in Canada, where most of the system, there's a smaller number of systems, and there is a single central government which is laying out a very, not a super clear, but a pretty clear decarbonization mandate. There is still this disconnection, though, between that federal government mandate, individual provinces who are regulating healthcare, even though it's all publicly funded. So I think navigating the challenges is also true in Canada, developing that life cycle cost per ton, sort of addressing that roadmap and the challenges of being a healthcare organization in what we call the big shift away from carbon. Like, how are you gonna, like, that's still very relevant and very valid here, and I think is true in a lot of places. I think what's unique maybe in Canada, which is good, is like, since we have so much public money that goes to healthcare organizations, and so much of what we spend is on healthcare, it is a significant portion of what we spend, as you showed, Kevin, and the proportion of emissions from healthcare and the opportunity to spend public dollars to learn to address the transition, and the opportunity for healthcare organizations to be leaders is significant. And I think right now there's a lot of money from the federal government in Canada, at least to get going very quickly. It's, there's an opportunity for healthcare organizations to take a leadership position, and many of our clients want to, even though the business of healthcare is, not the business of decarbonization or energy, providing energy or whatever. It's, if we can align that mission, there is actually quite a bit that can be beneficial, and as early adopters and leaders, I think, which is something we try and layer on to the navigating the roadblocks and challenges that might be coming, is, hey, what if we take a leadership position? Is there an opportunity there? Which we think is true for, and you touched on a little bit of that in the summary of the white paper too, which is great.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. And sticking with the Western Hemisphere here, Alvaro, is it a similar story in Chile that you're seeing down there as well, or what sort of challenges is the healthcare system down there finding investing in decarbonization?
Right. At least in Chile, the public healthcare system doesn't have the resources to provide the infrastructure that is needed today. So the public-private partnership is the way that is implemented now since 15 years. And the green building certification programs plays a role because while lacks standards or mandatory regulations for sustainability or energy efficiency, decarbonization, that voluntary programs helps to understand and quantify and define the targets to implement as a mandatory for the new projects. So that happens here.
Fantastic. And Vanessa, in New Zealand, is there also a struggle with the healthcare system looking at decarbonization versus healthcare funding? What sort of challenges are you finding down there?
Yeah, I think this, it's a global issue. I don't think there's any country that's going to put their hand up and say, yeah, we've got all the funding we need to do all the decarbonization and care for our patients. But I think, decarbonization and investing in decarbonization is not just that environmental imperative. We have to consider it. It's also strategic and economic one. And those two are really intrinsically linked, and we have to ensure that we have that mindset to understand that. And I think there's basically, as I see it, there's kind of 4 core areas that we have to look at. We have the cost savings, and I think other panelists have already spoken to this, but we have to ensure that we can achieve, the healthcare system itself can actually achieve significant savings by investing in that energy efficient infrastructure and systems and that efficient waste management. And this means engaging, as you said before, Kevin, engaging with our suppliers and manufacturers, looking upstream and downstream, and trying to build in more circular economies and accountability actually for end of life of our products and equipment as we see it. And we need to recognize financial, like we'll see some of those and recognize some of those financial savings in that operational cost through both the waste and energy reductions and efficiencies we can make. And if we start laying that groundwork, and I think this is where New Zealand, if we can start laying that groundwork as a strong foundation, we're actually going to be able to continue to support our decarbonization. A strong foundation in any house is really important. It's what holds us there. And those efforts and all of those efforts will actually help benefit our actual community's health and well-being as well. I think the second area is that resiliency and that equity, right? So we have to, in New Zealand, health equity is extremely important, and it's part of the agenda, no different than I'm assuming along, globalization too, so that the decarbonization strategies can help build more resilient organizations and kind of drive that financial value while contributing to health equity as well. The third one you touched on as well, and other individuals, was that regulatory compliance, right? So there's that growing global trend towards regulatory requirements for decarbonization. We see that in New Zealand as well. So I think by investing now, the healthcare systems can actually stay ahead of these regulations and start avoiding some of the potential penalties that may be coming. It's the carrot and stick that you had mentioned, and there's reputational damage that has to be considered, and even the cost of offsetting to meet these targets in the future. In New Zealand, that's a big consideration for some of our public sectors that have to set those targets, and they have to offset if they're not meeting them within the next few years. I think the fourth one for me is probably the closest to my heart. It's health impacts, right? So climate change is a health crisis. We know this. And the World Health Organization actually estimates that more than 13 million deaths around the world each year are actually due to avoidable environmental causes. So I think by stepping back and investing in that decarbonization in the healthcare systems, we can start to mitigate some of these health risks and actually start pulling back on the burden on our health services, and that we know are already stretched both physically and financially, right? We're already seeing skilled staffing shortages that are coming through. So I actually, by really investing in kind of that decarbonization now, we're doing it's considered a preventative approach, and we don't do that well in healthcare to date. So, addressing the root cause, which is climate change, and rather than just the symptoms, which are the health issues that we're seeing from this. For too long, we've sat as ambulances at the bottom of the hill, and we continue to apply these band-aids on the symptoms. So I get it. Well, funding constraints truly are a valid concern, and it's a big issue for everyone and across all the countries. But the investment in decarbonization is a strategic move, no different than any other business move that CEOs are making decisions on, or CFOs. It's a strategic move, and that can actually lead to improved health and the health outcomes. You know, your cost savings, that resilience I spoke about, and the regulatory compliance, right? So it's a necessary step towards that sustainable and equitable healthcare system. You know, and this isn't just New Zealand, it's a global, we should globally be targeting this. So that's kind of how I see us moving through that, and hopefully we can push towards that from a global scale as well.
Absolutely. And, you know, Zach, does that in the US, you know, just building on what Vanessa's saying, if there's a client that's thinking, you know, there's a conflict between designing for healing and designing for decarbonization, how, you know, what sort of answers would you have to them around that question?
Yeah, when you kind of drill down to the space or facility level design, I think there is that kind of assumption that they're opposing interests, but I don't think that there needs to be, or it's certainly less trade-offs than I think what people assume. And I think there needs to be more research and data sharing between our countries in this space, but there are some small studies and certainly, you know, anecdotal studies and general understanding that when we design green spaces, low energy, good indoor environmental quality spaces, we get better healthcare outcomes. There's studies showing that you know, increased exposure to daylight, which paired with dimming can reduce energy and carbon, but also improves recovery times and discharge rates with patients. The same is true for natural ventilation. And so I think that's some of the lessons are like a lot of that I think is coming outside the United States because it's been more of a focus on, you know, mechanical systems and infection control and things like that. So there are different lessons to be learned there. I think another interesting piece to that is what Vanessa was talking about, like resiliency, especially in the healthcare setting, is so huge. And that's why it's the third stool leg or pillar of the United States Health and Human Services Healthcare Climate Pledge is around resiliency and having a resilience and continuous operation plan. So a lot of the cases for delivering healthcare outcomes and more in a climate future are focused around emergencies and natural disasters, and being able to provide continuous service, especially to at-risk communities, is essential. And that's something that we can do in a more efficient, lower carbon way if we electrify our resiliency systems, our emergency power systems. You know, we talked a little bit about diesel generators. Those are some of the dirtiest, you know, point sources in our community. They're burning diesel fuel, which has higher, you know, NOx emissions and other emissions factors, which have negative, you know, respiratory outcomes. And even without major outages on the grid, that can easily account for like 5% of emissions on a US hospital, which is higher than most people would assume because they don't run all the time, but they have to be tested and things like that. So they recently changed regulation to allow electric battery energy storage, you know, BESS systems for emergency power backup in the United States. And I think that was a long time coming. And that kind of frees up the opportunity. You talked that kind of district map, talking about distributed energy resources, microgrids, how we can build resilient all electric infrastructure, can support health outcomes, designing healthy spaces, but also adding low carbon resiliency to continue to provide those services.
And Vanessa, I'm curious for you to maybe to even build on what you were saying before, you know, with your clinical, you know, you've got a bit of a clinical background in addition to the design and healthcare consulting work that you do. When you take a look at this concept of there being a conflict between decarbonization and designing for healing, what are your thoughts around that?
Honestly, you know, I think the relationship between designing for healing and decarbonization and health, it has been in the past considered a bit of a conflict, but it's actually not one. It's actually one that it works together well. So it's a synergy. It actually has synergistic qualities, right? And so when we talk about designing for healing, we're actually talking about creating a healthcare environment that's actually conducive to the well-being of our patients, the staff that we put in the hospitals, and actually the communities really in which those hospitals sit and serve, right? So we have to take the designing for healing as something that we're aiming towards. And this isn't a new concept. You know, I I nursed for years. And one of the first things we were taught way back when I was in school, and the first week was, you know, the founder of modern nursing, who was Florence Nightingale, who in 1800s actually recognized the importance of 3 key things to help patient healing. It was fresh air and sunlight, good nutrition, and sleep. And if you think for a moment and put yourself in any hospital, and for any of us who've experienced any hospitalization, can you say our hospitals are built or designed to provide any of those? So,
Right.
you know, I'm going to say, I would say no, because I've experienced those myself and with my kids. And, you know, you're never getting sleep with the noise that's in the hospital, the lighting, you're not getting fresh air, you're not getting those natural spaces Zach has talked about. And I think that's why we need to start thinking more holistically, right from that initial concept design for health centers and hospitals, right? And how we look to the future with it. We need to start integrating principles of, you know, social licensing and biophilic design, empathetic design, and taking cultural consideration into that, and which all actually feed into decarbonization strategies. And that in turn then makes that healing environment. So it creates that beautiful circular, a circular economy for our own health, right? If we consider it that way. And if we start to create, you know, energy efficient buildings, and Zach, you touched on this, if we create energy efficient buildings, they provide more comfortable and healthier indoor environments for patients and staff. We know this, we get better patient outcomes. You know, by using renewable energy, we actually can reduce that air pollution, which has direct health benefits. We can track that, and we know that. And if we start engaging in like the sustainable procurement, looking at those scope 3s, we can actually ensure that the healthcare sector is not actually contributing to environmental degradation, and which actually have indirect impacts on our health and our community health as well. So, you know, when I think about designing for healing and decarbonization in the health sector, these aren't conflicting goals, and they shouldn't be considered conflicting goals. So we need to stop seeing them as optional and or even add-ons into designs, and they actually represent kind of that dual mandate for the sector to both promote health and protect the environment. And you know, in my opinion, they're actually non-negotiables. They shouldn't even be an added thought that we need to do this. It should be just part of how we design. And I think by integrating some of these, you know, goals into the design and operation, what we can then do is create, and we can create those resilient hospitals, more sustainable, and the healthy futures for our patients and better patient outcomes, right? So it's, to me, it's a no-brainer, but I guess I may be sitting out there on my own, but I'm preaching to the choir when I'm speaking to this panel, but it's getting that word out there, and to the architect, to the designers, to everyone, just as they start thinking about, not, you know, months down the road when a design or business case is done, it's at those very key initial phases. Build it into your plans, right?
Right, absolutely. So that when we're looking at the plans and looking at that healthcare mission, I know, Anthony, you and I have talked a lot about infection control, and you know how we're able to reconcile the need for that, obviously, and fan energy and the HVAC systems. You know how, you know, during the discussion around the white paper, I know it was a pretty hot topic. Was hoping you might be able to chime in with some thoughts around how different systems are approaching infection control and from that HVAC point of view.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two. When we sat down and you showed the graph at the end there of the different, like, what kind of targets and expectations and average performance we saw in the different regions, I think a lot of us were kind of surprised, like where we more or less knew that the requirements for air changes were pretty strict and similar to our own context, like between Zach and I looking at the American and US numbers, like, yeah, those are pretty similar energy intensity numbers because the requirements are quite similar across that border. When we looked in other places where ventilation requirements are more relaxed, they're lower, I guess is the better way to say it, not relaxed, but they're lower. They have lower energy intensity, even if the mix of energy use or the types of technologies for generating energy are similar. And I think that it was that opened our eyes to the most, like, what I think was one of the most critical conversations we had, which is, is there a performance-based way like a health outcomes based way of understanding what ventilation requirements are really needed. And we know that, there have been examples where, I was early on in my career, part of a discussion about whether 100% outdoor air could be an alternate to a mixed air approach in different healthcare, in different environments, like in the patient room, versus having 6 air changes and 2 fresh air, 100% at 4 air changes. Would that be okay? And there were actually changes early on in the Canadian, allowances for these alternate 100% outdoor air approaches, and that's good. Like, that was on its way to, but I think there's another big step to take where we talk about what is the real amount of ventilation air that's required to achieve effective control, and not just ventilation, total ventilation, but also isolation and other things. Like, can we separate, what are the separation requirements in different parts of the hospital or health facility that allow us to still feel comfortable that there isn't an infection management risk? And I think that there's a lot of, like, it's easy to say, oh, well, we shouldn't worry about that. We shouldn't try and change the regulations because it's working fine now. But there is the decarbonization, and an energy efficient, cost effective kind of decarbonization hangs on us trying to explore these more performance-based approaches. And I think it means, if there are any regulators on the call or any health authorities who have a good line to the regulators in their country that actually want to bring up this question, we want to support any discussions that there can be around this, showing information about what is the real, what ventilation rate is really required in order to achieve proper control. And I think that's a conversation we would like to promote and be part of, because we know we can work with individual authorities, and I'll, Zach will touch on some of the ways that we do that perhaps, but the regulations are often where everyone turns. The rules that we need to follow are often where everyone turns, and if those are too strict and don't make sense in a modern context, well, where we're trying to decarbonize, we would like to address that. And so that was one of the important things that came up, I think, Kevin. So I'll pass it to Zach though to add to that, I think, too. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we don't have to go too far into the weeds on that, but one of the driving regulations around that is the ASHRAE 170 code, which tells us, it gives us those 2 air changes of outside air and 6 of recirculated air in a lot of our healthcare spaces, but it ranges upwards from that, to 10 or 20 air changes for ORs, and it is the single biggest driver for why hospitals in particular are among the most energy dense building typologies in the United States. And if you dig into the history of that a little bit, it's not nearly as statistically or scientifically based as you would like it to be. And I think that's one of the harder truths that we need to address, and that's why there's opportunity to work with future regulators. There's been very small studies that I was able to find that kind of showed diminishing returns after 2 air changes. But yet almost every space, even like low intensity spaces within hospitals that are not serving patients, still have that 6 and 2 requirement. So having more nuance around those lower intensity spaces, like ORs are a small fraction of healthcare spaces that we're providing. And you can understand why, like, I don't want to pull back on safety at all in an operating room. But for medical office buildings and administrative support spaces and things like that, I think you're seeing it open up a little bit just from the provider's perspective, that maybe it's okay to explore some of these different systems that we're seeing other countries deploy, like chilled beams, 100% outside air, fan coil systems, moving away from those big centralized VAV units that have a lot of fan energy, a lot of reheat energy, especially in places where we have to dehumidify. When you put all those things together, they're just really inefficient. And we're working through ways to try and improve that, but sometimes our hands are a little bit tied with regulation.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Zach and Anthony. And and maybe before we open it up to a couple of the questions, we've got some good questions coming in from the audience, and please feel free to put in more. I do have one last question, because I am curious, Alvaro, from a utility point of view. The utility and the grid decarbonization, while it's not the main focus of the paper, I know the environment in Chile is very different than the ones that I'm used to working in. I'm curious around what sort of impact electrification's had on energy suppliers down in Chile.
Well, in Chile, the electrification of the grid becomes quicker the last few years from solar system in the north of Chile. We have a lot of solar radiation, no? So I think there is an opportunity for buildings like hospital, the big ones, that have the space in the roofs to install this kind of system. And of course, depending of the local legislation, there is an opportunity to produce energy on site, and the excess, the surplus, being to inject to the grid, just to not avoid to use batteries and equipment that increase the capital cost of this system. So this can be a cost-effective way to materialize this kind of decentralization of producing electricity. And even here in the center of the Chile, it's quite common to install solar thermal system that can help to produce energy for domestic hot water in the order of 50% or higher from the total heat demand for hot water in yearly basis. I mean, so
And
that is a big opportunity. I mean.
And Anthony, if we switch climates to one that's very different and go up to the Canadian climate, what sort of challenges are you seeing up there, and how does it potentially impact healthcare design for our Canadian customers?
Yeah, like it's awesome to talk with Alvaro and others from different parts of the world. You learn pretty quickly that, things we knew already as I had done other work designing globally, but that the solutions are different. The sun creates a certain peak time that's different, and the energy needs are different. The needs for heating are different. So the technologies that we will pick will be different. So in Canada, the peak time for the grid is going to be, in the long run, will be in the middle of the night in the winter. So solar isn't going to help with peak demand reduction unless we have very large batteries to store that energy over the course of the day. And the sun isn't so great in the middle of the winter in Canada when that new peak will occur. So it's maybe that isn't the best technology, but the idea, the concept, which I think is touched on in the paper, and I think there's some really good examples that are super useful to talk to as in different areas. But the idea that the healthcare organization can be a contributor, like a net contributor to that grid, that grid stewardship process, right? And there's a great example in Ontario, Canada. One of the provinces here did a really quite an impressive piece of work, one of the most significant decarbonization projects in the past 25 years. From 2004 to 2014, in about a 10-year period, we cut the emissions from our grid down by about 90%, which is a huge effort. And that was more effort than had ever been invested in decarbonization in Canada before that single project. And that it's actually something that needs to happen in all grids. And you touched on that, is that effort to decarbonize the grid. But it wasn't just the operators of the grid and or those generating that did the work. It was also the people using energy and demanding power. And it was especially organizations like health authorities, which knew they had high power demands, regardless of whether they were using electricity for heating or not. They still had these big power demands. They were the ones who took up the mantle and the challenge of supporting the grid operator to achieve these significant reductions on the demand side, or they call it the energy efficiency side. And that was, I think we need another version of that, another sort of revolution where now the grid emissions are going back up in Ontario. We're maybe at the situation where we need, as we decarbonize all of the rest of our energy systems, the things that are burning fossil fuels locally, we also need to support the grid, and there's an opportunity for the hospital organizations to do that, and an important one, I think. So
yeah, absolutely. We have had a few questions come in from the audience, and I know we're running a bit late on time. So if anyone who's asked us anything, if we don't get to your question, please don't worry, we will follow up with everybody after the webinar to make sure the questions get addressed. But the first question, which I think is very, very interesting, touches a little bit on some of the supply chain issues, was the one we mentioned suppliers and manufacturers, which we were talking about. Are we thinking in material supply for healthcare operations? So things like operations, supply management, you know, that actual clinical supply chain, or are we simply referencing architectural construction materials? Maybe Vanessa, I'll throw it out to you first, knowing that a lot of the work that you do is in some of the supply chain management with some of our healthcare clients.
Yeah, and I think my mention of it was really looking at that supply chain, not from the building perspective. I'm sure Zach had mentioned it in some of the conversation he had, but in regards to New Zealand, you know, I think from a waste perspective, with the amount of materials that come through hospitals, and understanding that there is the importance of patient safety comes first 100% of the time. We have over 228 tons of waste annually that goes out the back doors, with 27 various waste streams, you know, from every one of our hospitals. So it's really engaging with those suppliers and manufacturers, going, what can we do differently, and start demanding, because I think for so long we've just accepted the products that have come through our door. We have to start pushing back and saying, what are you going to do for us, as you know, as hospitals? What can you bring to the table, and start taking accountability for the products that you're bringing, and give us something that we can actually manage on the other side of it when we have to waste it, in whether it's a reuse, recycle, reprocess situation, and kind of to establish that circular economy. There are programs, you know, we have PVC recycling programs that collect all the IV fluid bags and oxygen masks and tubing from our hospitals. They remold them into garden hoses, right? And that saves over 200 tons of high-grade PVC from waste to landfill. You know, we have Baxter suppliers who move from polystyrene actually into a wool pack, wool liners for all their products. So it's 100% biodegradable. So it's possible, and a lot of these organizations can make positive impacts, but we have to work together with them, and they're not going to do it on their own unless they start getting pushed back and being asked. Some are taking the lead, so I'll give credit where credit is due, but I think from a global perspective, that goes to what you were saying, is we need that communication from a global perspective to ensure that's there. So I'm not sure, from a construction point of view, I'll leave it to, you can pass on to one of the other panels to speak to that aspect of it.
And maybe Zach, in 1 minute or less, if you want to touch on the construction side of things as we get close to the top of the hour here, but your thoughts around the construction side.
Yeah, I think in the United States, it's even more exaggerated, where that scope 3 emissions is of the healthcare industry is higher than the scope 1 and 2. We've talked a lot about our direct and indirect, you know, energy emissions, which is scope 1 and 2, but that entire value chain is where a lot of the emissions lie. And there's been a lot of focus around construction embodied carbon and some real movement here in the US in the last 5 years. We're behind the UK and a lot of other places where that's a regulatory requirement to report on that, but California actually recently just passed a requirement to be reporting on embodied carbon for new construction for large projects. So there are things happening there, but the value chain really is significant. You go back to that pie chart, is significantly larger than the embodied carbon of construction. But it kind of gets to, you know, the healthcare organizations really are the leaders of the healthcare industry. And that's, I mentioned the Health and Human Services, the US Healthcare Pledge. It focuses on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions first. The resiliency is the other piece. And then the third piece is just reporting on our scope 3 supply chain emissions. And so you might ask, why are we focused on scope 1 and 2 if it's only maybe 20% of the overall emissions profile? But it's what we can directly control. And it sends a signal to the rest of the industry that we're serious about this. And we expect all of our partners in the value chain to also be decarbonizing. And that's kind of, you got to be the first mover in that space to bring the whole community along with you. And so we're just starting to have those conversations, as a bunch of those signatories to the pledge are now asking all their vendors for information relating to their emissions. And so I hope that conversation continues.
I think so. No, thanks very much, everybody, for the insights. I know we're getting close. There's a few other questions that did come in from the audience. We will follow up with everybody by email afterwards to make sure that those get addressed. But I did want to thank the panel for joining me today. Lots of great insights. I know there was a lot of discussion. We only touched the tip of the iceberg of a lot of the discussion that happened. We're actually developing the white paper and the issues around decarbonization in healthcare. We have shown up on the screen. If people are interested in continuing the conversation, please, by all means, feel free to connect with myself or any one of the 4 panels that we had on today. Our contact information is up here, as well as a QR code to download the report. We're also going to have, please stay on as the webinar ends. There's going to be a quick survey at the end around what other topics you might be interested in learning about. We're very curious around what our clients are seeing as burning topics so that we can look into developing more content and white papers and investigating potential solutions to the issues that we're all facing, especially in that healthcare space. So again, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to connecting with everyone again in the near future. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.